Howdy, everybody. I pray you had a wonderful week. This is a piece of Ambrosia maple. It's a crotch piece that Doug sent over to me from Pohl. It's still very green. It was just cut down a few weeks ago. So I'm really excited to turn it because it's a crotch piece and it also has some beautiful ambrosia markings. And I've never turned ambrosia maple, and I don't think I've turned green maple this wet before. So this is a new experience, a new wood to try to turn wet to finish. Turning green wood is definitely a different animal, and you cannot have the same expectations with wet wood as you would dried wood. I plan on doing a video here in the near future on wet wood and turning it from start to finish, and some things that you can do besides what I do in this video to help with the warping and cracking. But first off, you have to eliminate your expectations until you've turned quite a bit of it to see for yourself what it does. And that's why I encourage you to, one, turn wet wood, because most likely if you get a wet log, it's free. So you're practicing your cuts, practicing shapes and form, even though it might not stay that way. The same shape and form you turned when it was wet until it dries. But it's really good practice, and it also helps you understand your limitations with certain species and turning green wood. So I can go on and on and on about all kinds of my experiences with greenwood. I've turned it for a solid year before I actually turned dried wood. So it was quite an adjustment for me to turn dried wood after turning greenwood for so long. But for this piece, it has some curling in the crotch where the two pieces of tree grew together. So I'm having a hard time trying to cut it. It will tear out a little bit in some areas, and normally that happens even with curly woods that are just have curly grain, and wet as well. It gets a little more shaggier when you cut it when it's wet. So those are some things that you can expect to have to like sand out later on because of just the nature of the wood and the fact that you're turning wet. Throughout this piece I put mineral oil on it, and that helps to keep the wood hydrated. So as I'm turning it, it doesn't want to start moving while I'm turning it. The idea of it is to keep it good and moist until I finish getting the shape, so I'm not having to try to cut wood that's just continually changing on me and warping and wobbling. So that's one thing I would definitely recommend, is keep a spray bottle of either mineral oil or even water will work as well, depending on what final finish you want to put on it later on. Your decision to use mineral oil or water will vary. The finish you put on it will just continue to get absorbed into the piece as it dries, because the finish you put on will displace the water. So as the piece dries, the water releases, it's soaking in whatever you put on it. So try not to expect a real high gloss finish right off the lathe, because it's just going to continue to dry and absorb that in, and it'll be very uneven. So I just use mineral oil and then until it's good and dry, and then I can use some other finish after it's dried out a little bit more, and it will tend to stay better because it's drier. So I put another coat mineral on it before I hog out the inside. And I'm trying to get rid of some of the pith, but not all of it, because there's some really, the most interesting grain and stuff is on the other side of the pith, which I'm having to remove some of it to keep it from cracking and warping on me later on. The pith is the cause of most problems in wood that wants to continue to move, so it's ideal to get all of it out. In this particular situation, I didn't want to get all of it because I was getting rid of a lot of the characteristics of that piece if I had gotten rid of all of the pith. So I went ahead and took a chance and decided to leave it in and just see what happens. I didn't want to sacrifice the character of the wood. So sometimes it's, a hit or miss on these pieces and how you decide to go about them. So right now I'm just focusing on trying to get my rim thickness, and as I go, I'm checking to see where cracks and things that are already existing in there and trying to cut those out as much as I can, because those will cause and influence further cracks in my piece. So I'm just checking as I go to make sure I'm getting enough material out that will affect my final piece, and then of course I'm putting mineral oil on it every so often just to keep it from warping on the lathe while I'm trying to establish its thickness. There's still a little bit of vibration, so I'm getting a little bit of tool marks, and was hoping that the negative rake scraper would help to smooth all that out. But unfortunately, because this is wet wood, all your tools are going to kind of respond a little differently. And being this has like a lot of curly grain, all that scraper was doing was just roughing up and making that curly just more shaggy. After the first couple of times of using it, I was like, why do I keep on using the scraper? It's just causing more, you can almost see it where it's just more shag. And it was better off just using my gouge, because at least I was able to cut it to minimize that shag that was happening in that curly grain. Sometimes, you just do something over and over again expecting different results. I think that's the definition of insanity. So yeah, occasionally I have those moments where I go back to a tool that I know is not working, but I'm willing to, just check and see. And then I'm going back over with my gouge. So that's why you see me going back and forth with the scraper and then the gouge. The gouge was definitely a much better choice, because it was able to cut through that shag, I guess that curly grain, and give me a much smoother cut. So just advice, use those different tools and see how they affect the wood, because not all the time I have problems with using my scraper with wet wood. It's just this particular case. The interesting thing about the ambrosia markings in these trees, in particular this maple, is caused by an ambrosia beetle. The ambrosia beetle actually attacks trees that have a certain fungus growing in the tree already. So they really only eat away at trees that are already compromised. So because they eat the actual fungus in the tree, they're not eating the tree. I thought that was pretty interesting, and there's several different trees that they will attack. So it's not just maple. There's several different ambrosia woods that have these markings in it. But either way, they're really interesting and create some really beautiful effects for us to display out of them. So right before sanding 80 grit, I smother on a good coat of mineral oil. And I continue to sand that all through until I start getting dry bits flying from it. Then I'm now adding denatured alcohol, which that's going to help to dry up, because I'm trying to dry the grain now so that way I can smooth it down. All that curliness and everything else is staying really shaggy. So my intention was to continue going through all the grits with mineral oil, but because of this grain and how it's responding, it needs to be drier in order for me to be able to knock down that fuzzy furriness that's happening with the grain. So I just spray it down really good with the denatured alcohol. I took my heat gun to it for about, I don't know, 5, no more than 10 minutes, just to kind of dry it up. And you can tell because as you're sanding, you're able to smooth that down. Now I'm adding my abrasive paste, and the reason why I chose this over the other is because this paste is really sticky and it has a lot of grit in it. I put 2 different grits in this paste, and I wanted to really try to smooth down any furry, inconsistent grain that I was getting from, the wood being wet and then dry. Now I'm just wiping that all the way, and I'm going to put on the paste wax, the Satilla paste wax, and then I'll put on a coat of just regular old beeswax that will, I'm not trying to get a perfect high shine or anything with this, because I know as this dries it's going to absorb that finish, and I can just apply mineral oil or whatever finish I plan to put on it after this starts to do its whole thing while it's drying. So the beeswax is just to kind of seal it up really good and give it a nice smooth finish. The beeswax will also help slow down some of the drying process so it won't warp as badly while it's sitting on the counter trying to take its final shape. So that's always helpful if you have solid beeswax. Now I'm wrapping it in rubber bands because I seen a female turner, and I can't remember her name to save my life. She doesn't have a YouTube channel, but I seen on Facebook where she wraps her pieces, her wet turn pieces, in rubber bands, and it helps to keep the piece from warping so badly. And being this has 3 different piths in it, I knew that I was going to get pretty crazy warping, if not cracking, going on, and so I was trying to just minimize that. These are just some things that you can do to minimize warping and cracking. There's people that will tape them up. I've done that for a few bowls. I've taped them up, the rims, especially if the pith is still in there. And so this method worked pretty decent. I did get warping still, as you'll notice in the pictures towards the end. I still get warping. So I have tape wrapped around the rim just to keep those rubber bands from sliding downwards, and I really didn't want to be snapped with a rubber band, going that fast. So the backside I'm just smoothing out, trying to get it as thin as I can so that way it's more consistent thinness throughout the piece, so the drying will be a little more consistent. Sanding it down really good, putting my brand on, and oiling it the same way I did with the rest of the piece. And all that's left to really do is sit it on the counter and wait to see what happens in the next few days as far as movement and warping. And in the end, you'll see the images that I put up after I removed the rubber bands. I think after 3 days, I removed the rubber bands because I felt that all that it was moving was going to move. The piece didn't feel as damp. You can kind of feel the dampness in the piece after it's turned, and I just kind of took the rubber bands off and after 3 days and let it do what it's going to do. So the images were, the pictures of the bowl were taken approximately 4 days after I turned it, just to give you an idea of how much has changed in those couple of days. Thank you, Doug, so much for sending me this piece of wood. It was so much fun to turn, and it is absolutely beautiful. So I appreciate you. Thank you. So I pray you all have a wonderful weekend. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you guys enjoyed. Take care and God bless.